Welcome to Built with Grit. I am your host and strategic partner in cost reduction, Luis Fernandez. And today we're joined by Jim Cantrell, CEO of Phantom Space. But before we get into that, if you're a fan of inspiring people and informative content, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So go ahead and rocket the like button into outer space. And with that, Jim, how are you doing, sir?
Doing very well today. Thank you.
So one of the things that I talk about is that behind every product, every service, everything that we exchange funds for, there is heart. There is somebody that took a risk, that put it on the line, put a lot of sweat and a lot of hours into bringing that thing to us. And I think sometimes it's missed. We just use these products and miss out on everything that's behind them. And that's what I'm trying to do here is pull that out and let people see those stories and hear that stuff. And with, you being in the space industry, something that I find absolutely fascinating, it's kind of a magical place, there's
Yeah.
so much that we don't know. And it's beautiful and it's dangerous and it's really neat, and it's a complicated problem, and watching people figure out how to solve it, I think is very exciting. So I'm always, I probably enjoy this more than anybody else. So thank you for coming out.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
So why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself? Where are you from originally?
Originally from a little town called Yucaipa in Southern California, and raised on a chicken ranch. And you believe that. And the weather's very similar to what it is here in Tucson, but I ended up going to high school in Silicon Valley back in the 70s and early 80s, and then got my education in the university in Utah, and ended up there sort of by circumstances that really didn't, I'm not Mormon or anything like that. I just ended up there because my dad got a transfer in his job, and looked like a good school, so that's where I went.
So did you know from a young age so I can imagine growing up on a chicken farm, there was probably a lot of time that you spent looking at the night sky?
Yeah, a little bit of that. I mean, I've always been the guy that likes things that move, right? Ever since I was a little kid, they got pictures of me, where they dressed me up in these stupid ties and things to, have the commemorative 3-year-old, 4-year-old picture. And the only way I'd ever allow them to do that is if they bought me a little toy car that I could bring along, so if it moved, I was fascinated by it. And that went all the way from, little 3-wheelers, big wheels as we called them, to little wooden go-karts we used to build to go down the hill, to real go-karts, to cars, to motorcycles, and eventually to rockets and satellites. So if it,
Of course.
faster it goes, the more I like it.
So the Matchbox was the gateway drug.
It was definitely the gateway drug. I mean, machines, I don't know. I just love machines. I drove my father crazy, tearing apart things. My mother would defend me. She would say, "Oh, it's a creativeness," but he tore apart our bathroom scale. And I just wanted to see how it worked. I was always that kind of kid. And my dad, he didn't understand stuff like that. He wasn't wired that way. And
Yeah.
in fact, nobody in the family was. I was just kind of the weirdo. So it wasn't so much looking at the stars until later. I actually watched this series on PBS, and mind you, in the 70s, PBS was one of the few channels that talked about serious science things.
Yeah.
We had like 4
Cosmos.
channels. Yeah, Cosmos, exactly. Carl Sagan.
Yep.
Who I later actually knew personally, which
What?
was, yeah, it was
Okay.
like one of these things that happen in life that you don't expect. But
That's
no,
awesome.
Carl taught me the love of science through Cosmos, right?
Yeah.
That was what got me thinking about, what, why are we here? What's out there? How do we get there? And that became a bit of a fascination for me as well.
So what did you study in college? Were you an engineer?
Yeah, I started out in electrical engineering, and that's because my stepfather was that, and I was horrible at it. I flunked out, to be honest with you. And
Wow.
one day, one of my friends who was in mechanical engineering, he said, "What the hell's wrong with you? You're a gearhead. Why aren't you in mechanical engineering?" And I couldn't come up with a good answer, so I looked into it and I switched over, and immediately my grades went up. So
Wow.
So yeah, I got my first bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, barely, right? I had to petition graduate school to let me in on probation, and I made it through astrodynamics and mechanical engineering with a 3.94 grade point average just to prove I could do it. I think
Nice.
so. So yeah, once you figure out what you're passionate about and you're good at and people want, then success happens. You know, it's those three things
Hmm.
that come together to make success.
So what'd you do right out of college? I assume you got a 9 to 5er?
Well, no. So that was a strange. My life has just been a series of strange events, and so about halfway through my graduate degree, I ended up getting this uh, internship at Jet Propulsion Lab, and it was with a bunch of these guys who were part of the Apollo era, and that were my bosses, right? And so I'm
That's
very
so cool.
fortunate. Yeah, it was really cool. I mean, my boss was the program manager of the first Ranger missions, which were the first, U.S. missions to the moon. And he's a very, very humble guy, still alive, today, Jim
Wow.
Burke. And so Jim was involved with this Mars balloon study. He had money from NASA headquarters to study balloons on Mars, which was fascinating. Again, anything that moved, I was into it.
Yeah.
And so I became a quick study on balloons. And this particular mission that was going to happen was a French mission on a Soviet ride to Mars in 1992. So it was a Mars 92, which was a Soviet-led launch and satellite, and the French were going to build a balloon. So we were kind of working, in parallel to them. And the concept was a balloon that with the sun would heat it up during the day, go up to an altitude, the winds would blow it around, and at night when it cooled down, it'd go back down the surface at a new landing spot. And the idea was to let the winds at night sort of move it around the surface so you could get pictures and measurements and things like that. The problem was that the basic design then was what I call the Samsonite suitcase. So if you drag that along the ground, it falls into the next hole that's big enough to swallow it, and it never comes out. And so Jim and I invented this thing called the Snake, which was a long distributed mass payload. It was basically a rope, a mechanical rope, and that would drag over these surface features. And if it was large enough compared to the surface features, it wouldn't fall in it. So just like it's like a real snake. And so we got a patent on that. And so it turns out it worked so well that the French decided to baseline that for their mission to Mars. So by the time I was graduating, they hired me to go to the French Space Agency. And so this kid from a chicken farm in Yucaipa, California, who knew no French, took his wife and young daughter and went over to France and showed up on the job, in April of 1990. So that was on a Soviet mission to Mars, and that was I learned French pretty quickly. It took me about 6 months before I could speak it, but within a year I was fluent. But I also learned Russian, and
Wow.
so I discovered I was pretty good at learning languages. And so I took Russian lessons when I was in France. The team was doing it, so I just joined them. And we went over to Russia a couple of times. And in fact, I was there when the putsch happened in August of '91. And so that led to once the putsch happened, that whole project I could tell was going to go downhill because the Russians ceased being paid. Our colleagues, they were all paid by the state because it was a communist country.
Mm.
And for whatever reason, once the putsch happened, nobody got paid, and they were all living off of savings and their mattress and whatnot. So it was pretty clear that whole program was going to die. So I headed back to the United States. I couldn't get anybody to hire me after that because I was considered a bit of a traitor. I had worked with the French, who
Oh,
they
yeah,
weren't
the
exactly
timing of
friendly.
this.
Right. And mind you, I was voting for Ronald Reagan back then, right? And I've always been an ardent, hardcore anti-communist.
Yeah.
And here they are, they're piling me in with the Soviets. And so I had to actually go back to Utah to my professor there. He was a retired U.S. Air Force colonel. And he's, I called him. I say, Frank, I can't find you. He goes, oh, just come back. We'll bring you back. We got a little lab here and give you a job. So I said, fine. That was better than nothing.
Yeah.
So I went back there within about a month of, working on a little study with him for some small satellite. he shows up in my office and he's got a friend of his from West Point, where he graduated from years back. And this guy is from one of the intelligence agencies. And I'm thinking I'm in real trouble, right? Because they're going to carry me away. And he says, I was telling my friend here that you speak Russian and you know the Soviets. And he says, yeah, he says, we need help. We're trying to stop brain drain. He says, now that the Cold War's over, he says, we're actually going in there and trying to put money into the economy to keep these guys from going to North Korea and Iran. And would you help us? And I said, of course I will, So that began about 6 years where I went back and forth to the Soviet Union, or former Soviet Union, spent time in Russia, and we began a relationship with another university over there, Moscow Aviation Institute. And we were essentially funneling DoD money into that over there and trying to outbid the Iranians and the North Koreans on stuff. So we converted ICBMs to satellite launchers, and we launched one out of a Russian submarine, two satellites out of a Russian submarine.
Really?
We launched another missile defense experiment out of Kazakhstan, a joint one with the Russians and so forth. So that was all very interesting until it wasn't. And I left there in about 1998 and refused to go back. So we ended up, I actually got arrested accused of espionage. We've got put under house arrest because of some circumstances that somebody wouldn't pay a bribe, and this is kind of their way of dealing with it. Yeah.
In Russia, you got arrested.
Yeah. So held in an apartment for about a month.
Dude, you say that like so nonchalant. Yeah, I got arrested in Russia on espionage charges, So anyway.
At the time, it was a big deal, right? And
yeah.
We were instructed by our guys in the U.S. State Department that we weren't to talk about this, but at the same time, they weren't helping, right? So nobody in the U.S. State Department would help us. The local embassy, we would always go and brief the attaché there, the defense attaché, what we were doing, and they all knew what we were doing. We weren't spying on these guys. We were trying to help, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but what killed me was how the government just totally abandoned us. And they called us non-official cover spies. That they were sort of this little whispering campaign. So it turned out one of the guys on our board was a guy named Senator Jake Garn. And Jake Garn, retired Air Force general, also retired senator from Utah, also car guy. Okay. And so every time we'd have a board meeting and I'd brief, he and I would talk about cars. And when he heard about this, he said, "Oh, this is really horrible. Let me see what I can do." So he calls Al Gore, and he and Al served in the Senate together.
Who else are you going to call? Al,
right?
Of course, right?
Yeah, better call Al, right? And I guess Al Gore, finally had a phone call with Trina Mearden. So one day we're in this apartment, and it was this nice lady named Nadezhda who took care of us. And of course, when she left at 11 at night, she'd lock the door behind her, and we couldn't get out. And then she'd show up at 5, and cook breakfast for us in the mornings and things like that. There was 2 of us that were in the apartment with her. And
so was your family back in the States, or were they with you in Russia?
They were in the States, yeah. And I couldn't tell them what was going on. So this was my first wife, and she remains, I think, convinced to this day I had a Russian mistress or something over there. And she said that.
Sorry, maybe that's not very funny, but I mean.
Well, it wasn't at the time, but it is now, right? This is 25 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So at any rate, so we got out, and we were done after this letter showed up from Trina Mearden, and showed up with our passports and so forth, so we were allowed to go. But it wasn't until it was 2000 I started going back to Russia. So these internet guys were as the internet bubble was going full speed, wanted to get into space, right? And they want to do private space, and I was allowed to consult being a university employee. So they would call me, and I'd help them. And one guy wanted to do a solar sail mission, so we took him over there. It was one of the founders of Idea Lab, Bill Gross, and we took him over there. And then in July of 2001, this guy named Elon Musk calls me out of the blue.
Of course.
And he says, yeah, I mean, I'm on my way home, right? And I got the top down on the car. It's a Friday. Phone rings, and it's a 650 area code from Palo Alto, because I used to live out there. So I'm like, okay. It might be somebody I know. So I picked it up, and it was Elon, and he just went blah, 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 about, how he wanted, be a multi-planetary species and get, humanity off of oil. And I mean, I got the whole speech, right? And I'm like, Elon, I actually thought his name was Ian. I said, hey, I got the top down. When I get home, can I call you? Because I can't really hear you. And he goes, yeah, no problem. So I get home, I call the phone number again, and it's a fax machine. And I'm like, right, a wealthy internet millionaire or whatever, with a fax machine, what the hell? So I didn't call back. And then, 15 minutes later, I get this call, and he's pissed this time. You never called me back. And like, yeah, I did. I got your fax machine. Oh, okay. Well, this is my mobile. Da da da. So he wants to meet right away, and he wants to do this private Mars mission, and he needs to buy Russian rockets, and he knows I'm the guy to help him. So I'm like, okay, I'll hear everybody out. And but he wants to, fly his private plane in on Saturday morning and come to my house. And I'm like, no, this is my house. And so all I could do was lie. And I said, so I'm busy tomorrow, and I'm flying out of Salt Lake City on Sunday. Why don't we meet there in commercial? And I did that because I knew he couldn't pack a weapon behind security. And this was pre 9/11, so you could actually just go behind security. And arrange for a conference room in the Delta. Well, you called it the Crown Room back then, and the Delta Lounge, and that's where we first met. So that led to SpaceX, right? So when we went back over a few more times to buy these rockets, we did the study on the Mars mission and figured out which ones we needed. And I put a big team of people together that later became the original group of SpaceX. We went over to buy the rockets, and Russians basically told Elon to piss off, and we walked out of there, hat in hand. And one of the guys that was with us, named Mike Griffin, who later became the NASA administrator, and he was part of this original crew. And on the way back on the airplane, Elon announces to Mike and me as we're drinking after takeoff, he, of course, you got to have a whiskey or something after you leave the Soviet Union. It's exactly. Yeah. So he turns around, he says, guys, I think we can build this rocket ourselves. And Mike and I are like, yeah, right. Whole line of dead bodies out in front of you, dude. And so that's how SpaceX started. So I was with him another 9 months or so, and then I left his company at that point.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. First off, I'm a little blown away. I'm trying to play this cool, right?
Yeah,
like
right.
I'm gonna keep it together. But I hadn't thought about that when taking on the idea of the multiplanetary and SpaceX. The first thing you said is whole line of dead bodies, and that's something that really, honestly, I had never occurred to me until just now when you said it. Like, this is a serious risk, not just financial.
Yeah,
because this isn't a government that isn't going to get sued.
20 years ago, we used to tell Elon, and it's still somewhat true, how do you become a millionaire in the space business? And he'd say, I don't know. And he'd say,
start with
as a billionaire. Yeah. And it's really true. I mean, but you look at what he's done, he's become the richest man in the world off of this, and Tesla. So, I mean, the laughs on all of us, but you're right. It was 20 years ago, it was absolutely government dominated, nation state dominated. They were the only ones that could afford to take these kinds of risks with public capital. And in large part, the success of SpaceX still is due to a very wise investment of public capital, the COTS program, which funded, SpaceX basically to build the Falcon 9, because that was almost $1 billion. I think Elon told me 875 million they spent on the Falcon 9. So very good use of public money, but this created a whole new generation of thought, and that generation of thought is, well, if Elon can do it, then we can do it. So he made space safe for investments, and so then there was another sort of little group of companies that came along. One of them was called Skybox Imaging, and I helped those guys get started as well. There were some friends of mine out of the intelligence agencies that wanted to build small, basically spy satellites for $1 million a piece, and I said, well, I think we can do this based on some of the stuff I'd done in Russia. I could see how we could do this. And so, we raised, I don't know, it was like $80 million, built a few of them, and then Google bought the company for $500 million. So that created
Jeez.
the second wave after SpaceX, and we call that all the skybox imaging wave. And that's the one we're still riding right now. And I think we're about to see a number of these companies. There's just so many companies that have been funded by venture capital, private equity, and family offices, and that money's starting to pay off. We're starting to see companies go public with this, and there's a huge interest in the public sphere to invest in these kinds of companies. So I'm very bullish on it. I look at this space economy as being really the equivalent of the new world, right? If we were in the 1500s and we were Spaniards, we'd stand on the shore of Spain and watch the galleons head off to the new world to come back with full gold. But we had no clue, right, of how big this economy would be in the new world. I mean, it's arguably millions of trillions of dollars that have come out of the new world, unimaginable at that time. And I think we stand at the same shore in space, to use the Cosmos Carl Sagan analogy of a space economy. And we just don't know what's going to happen there. We don't know what the app is. That's why you're so excited. It's a mind blower.
Yeah.
And it's so infinite. It's fun to think of. And so when you get to phantom space, you say, what does phantom space do? Well, we looked at this whole space economy and we said, okay, we don't know what this is going to be, but one thing you're going to have to do is to be able to put stuff in space, move it around in space, and bring it back.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build that infrastructure. And we're trying to do it in a way much like Henry Ford did for the terrestrial transportation infrastructure using mass production. And it's my belief, and being a hardcore capitalist, that mass production is what actually created the economy that we have today. The Industrial Revolution happened, but then the mass production revolution happened a little over 100 years ago, beginning with Henry Ford. And he made cars affordable to the average man, whereas before that, it was really just the rich and the nobility that could afford it.
He fundamentally changed how we create any product.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then that is, I've been a program manager myself before bringing new products to market, and I know the process by which you create an assembly line. That is recreating something that has been created before, and oftentimes I have sat there and thought about how production was, and how this dude just said, what if, and I can imagine like him having this discussion with people, his little board of advisors. He's like, what if we just have one guy who's trained to put in 17 bolts, and the next guy puts in a different 20, and the next guy puts in, and we just kind of move it along this line, and that's just it's crazy. I mean, obviously, like today we look at this and it makes sense, right? Like we just know that, but to think about, right, because we have this experience, but for someone to develop that idea, how revolutionary is that? I mean, that's a complete change. I can't even think of a good analogy of what that is like.
Right. Exactly. No, Henry Ford was a revolution that changed our world even today. And all we're doing is continuing Henry Ford's revolution into the space business, because right now, I mean, look, every time a rocket lifts off, people clap. I mean, unless you're in Russia, I guess you just don't do that with airlines, for example.
Yeah.
I've been on airlines there where they all clap, when
me too.
it lands. Yeah. But, generally that just kind of tells you where we're at in the stage of things in space exploration. It's still a very novel, bespoke kind of experience. And I don't want to at all diminish what SpaceX is doing, because, we stand on their shoulders, all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And, but it's not enough. And, we have to come in and fill in behind that in ways that make sense. So what drives me is really that idea of actually creating the possibility that the young people of this world can inherit a much easier way to get into space. Because I tell you what, in the early days, we had to claw our way into it. It was hard, and you had to put up with 5 years of maybe it's going to work, maybe it'll blow up on the pad, maybe somebody forgot to tighten a bolt in the damn thing and die halfway to Mars, whatever. We can't build an industry on that. And my legacy, if I hope I leave one, is that I was part of the change agent that made space an everyday thing.
So a few things. One, I want to ask you a little bit about how this space revolution can also. One is, what it's going to look like, what you foresee in the future. Two is how we can use those in a terrestrial way. Some of those I'm thinking about, like travel, international travel,
Sure.
going. But one thing that I think is important to mention. Currently, or it sounds like from my understanding, that rockets are produced individually.
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're bespoke. They're like, if you know much about cars, they're kind of like the way Rolls Royces were always produced. They all look the same, but they had unique features, every one of them. If some of the older Ferraris that are now worth 20-30 million dollars, at the time they were all hand built. Luigi had this one and Marcello had that one, and they all were different, right? Because Marcello built this car a little differently than Luigi did. And rockets are still the same way. And it's really a function of not launching a lot of them, that there's sort of an inherent human tendency to want to make things better. I always tell my guys, better is the mortal enemy of good enough. But that tendency is always there. And then there's always customization that's justified by the large cost. So if let's say you're spending 100 million on your satellite and 100 million on the rocket, typical for a SpaceX mission, $200 million, to have $5 or $10 million of non-recurring engineering to change a few things around is not an unquestionable kind of thing. But if you're talking about $100,000 rocket and $100,000 satellite, for example, that becomes a really stupid proposition. So they're just fundamentally different things, and they're customizable, just like cruise ships. Each cruise ship's different, and they're just low enough production that that makes sense. And so the large rockets, the other part of it is it takes so long to produce them. This reusability actually creates the possibility of quicker turnarounds.
Yeah,
And
that was an amazing feat.
yeah, oh yeah, no, to bring that sucker back and to be able to use it, we did that with the space shuttle, but every time they took the space shuttle up, they'd have to tear the engines off and rebuild them. So it'll be a little bit like if you got in your car and you went somewhere and you had to rebuild the engine when you got back from seeing your mother-in-law. That's how the shuttle was. And originally, like, the shuttle was they were selling it that it would cost $300 a kilogram to get into space. Well, it ended up being something north of $60,000 a kilogram.
Wow.
was what the costs were. SpaceX has brought this back down to about $2,500 per kilogram. We think mass manufacturing can bring it down to about $400, $500 a kilogram, as the shuttle originally saw it.
Wow. That's a 75% reduction in cost.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
massive.
once you do this, now space becomes available to more people.
Right.
If you have to write $100 million check just to play in the club, there's not that many people that can write those checks. Not many companies, not many nations, as a matter of fact.
Right. So tell me, I still want to get into those other questions, my own little fascination.
Sure.
But tell me about getting Phantom Space started. So you were with SpaceX. You moved. Is that when you started Phantom, and how did you get to Tucson?
Yeah, well, I came to Tucson sort of in between SpaceX and Phantom. So back in what was it, 2007, I met my second wife, and it was on a job at Raytheon. And by chance, actually, we had met in Key West where I was living, and I saw her in a bar, and then later in a meeting at Raytheon, here she was in the meeting. I thought, wow. So I asked her. I said, "Were you in Key West recently?" And she thought I was trying to, date her or something, but I wasn't. I was just curious. And it was like serendipity, here she is. So we ended up, becoming friends. And then later, I moved down here. So that's why I'm here. And I had at the time a business that I could move. It was called Strat Space. And I started that right after I left SpaceX. And Strat Space, we consulted. We also designed satellites, and I think we built like 4 satellites. LightSail, if you're familiar with the Planetary Society light sail. Those were my projects, and I did Cosmos 1 with them as well, which were also commercial solar sails. And I was involved in 40 other NASA missions and private commercial missions. So had a lot of interesting experience there. But we started a company called Vector in 2016 here in Tucson, and that ran into troubles in 2019, mainly because of the technology that we started with. We acquired a company to start with, really was as far along as we thought. By the time we got 3 years into it, we started to all have differences among the co-founders. And so I left, and they went bankrupt in December of 2019. And so Phantom was really sort of, Mike D'Angelo is a co-founder. He and I had worked together on a company called Moon Express, and knew each other, and we just wanted to do something together. And we started examining the space economy and said, well, space transportation really is still the thing that makes sense. And we still didn't think that anybody was doing it right. And there's a lot of small launch manufacturers out there, but by our way of looking at it, nobody was really talking about mass manufacturing in a serious way. And I built a lot of things in my life, and most of the people that were building rockets were, more of the traditional background, in working in aerospace and so on, where they didn't really think about mass production. So that's kind of where we came from. And so we formed the company in October 2019. We actually ended up with a satellite contract about November of that year, and we're going to deliver our first satellite at the end of this year. It'll fly at the end of this year, and it's ultimately for a military customer. It was for another private company that we're working with. And but we started building our rocket, so we started designing it and so forth, and we've raised I think about $5 million so far for that. And we took a totally different approach from most other rocket companies. We were really contrarian in the way we ended up. And we didn't do it just to be contrarian, although that sounds appealing. It was not the sole reason why we did it. We looked at, it takes 7 years for every one of these rocket companies from the time they say they're going to do it to the time that they actually manage to get to space. And on that 7 years, you've got to develop engines, you've got to develop the avionics, the software, all these things. And most people develop all of those things themselves because Elon did it. And the reason we did that at SpaceX, I was there, I knew, was because we didn't want to lock ourselves into the cost, the cost structure that was really a part of the military industrial complex back 20 years ago. On top of that, we knew that any of the major suppliers like engines, for example, Aerojet or Rocketdyne, were ultimately beholden to companies like Lockheed Martin, like Boeing. And once they saw a disruptive force like Elon Musk, of course, this never happens, Amazon never tends to knock anybody off their servers because they may be a competition for a friend. But just imagine it could happen 20 years ago, that Boeing or Lockheed might try to knock SpaceX off the pedestal. So we decided we had to vertically integrate everything. Well, the time has changed, and there's a supply chain that's come into place over the last 4 or 5 years, particularly in the launch business. So we're able to buy our engines from a company in Colorado. We actually licensed our avionics and software from NASA. They developed a whole computer and software for the rocket that we just stepped into it through a license agreement with them. And the rest of it, we have to build our structures and some of the valves and things like that. But we cut the time down to build this from 7 years to 3.5 years. So we think that that obviously saves us a lot of money that we don't have to raise. So we think we can do this for a third the money in half the time. And so that's one of the differences for us. We're hair on fire. We have our first development model actually coming together right now. So we got some of the parts yesterday, our domes for our tanks, and so hopefully in a few months we'll have some real impressive hardware to start showing, and designs moving along very smartly. And as we're doing things in parallel, so building development models and furthering the design as we go. So one informs the other in the way we're doing this.
That's awesome. Yeah, third of the cost, half the time. That's beautiful. You call yourself a capitalist. You're certainly living the model. You know, there are a couple things that I was as I listened to your story, you know, and trying to think about the reality of some of these things, and thinking about, you know, you have. So it sounds like your first business was in Key West, right? Is that, or your
It
the
was
mobile?
it was Utah. Yeah, it was Utah, but yeah, it was QS for a couple of years.
You know, that's you making that jump, and honestly, I mean, you had worked for some um, relatively secure, you know, government and university and the like, to make that leap from the first and 15th of the month, getting your
Yeah,
influx of cash,
yeah,
to saying, I'm going to start a space company. Right. That's quite a jump. And you
it
know,
was.
um, I'm interested in hearing more, you know, what that experience was like. And then, you
Sure.
know, I think um, we look at some of these guys like Elon, because we're on a first name basis, and see the successes of these business owners and stuff. And I think maybe we miss out on, you know, zoom back to you know, Bezos in his closet apartment with, you know, his little handwritten Amazon thing. You know, that was a risk, right? So I'm curious
Right.
about you know, your own jump into the unknown.
Well, you're right. It is a jump. I remember the distinct feeling when I had left. It was called the Space Dynamics Laboratory at Utah State University, and you're right. It was a very secure place. We had 300 and some odd people that worked there, and it was very stable, and nobody ever got laid off, and but it was somehow unsatisfying, right? It's so I like to race cars, so it's kind of the equivalent of just driving around in a I don't know, a Toyota Camry, to pick on Toyotas.
Jim, I
It,
used to jump out of airplanes in the military. I know exactly what
got
you're
it. So
talking
you
about.
understand exactly what I'm
Yeah.
talking about. So literally, falling into SpaceX was like jumping off a cliff. I felt like I had parachuted off a cliff with my family behind me. I used to use that analogy, and had never parachuted before, but here we're going to go do it, right? So you're right. And then when I left SpaceX, I felt like I had no choice. I couldn't get along with Elon, and I didn't think I was going to last with him, and I just decided, well, I had a chance to go start my own other company, so I'll just go do that. I had enough of the company. I probably should have stayed, but that's be what it is now.
Mm.
Uh, every time I did that, every successive jump became less of a feeling of falling off with my family. Suddenly I realized my family's still fine back on the cliff. It's just me jumping, and I'm better at jumping this time. And you learn these successive times. So by the time I got to starting Vector and now Phantom, I started an automotive company along the way as well. You kind of know the ropes, and it's old hat, but it's always exciting. It never loses its appeal and its allure, right? And never been in battle, but I'm guessing it's probably what it feels like to face the enemy. It's never a boring experience. So,
No, it's not boring.
yeah,
That's true.
yeah. And it's got all the same elements, right? It's got unpredictability. It's very unpredictable. You don't know the outcome. You don't know the strength of what you're going to encounter. You could get seriously hurt, right? You can get
Mhm.
financially very hurt, and in some cases, your health can degrade. I've seen people do that too.
Mm.
I had some of that myself, just from the stress of it.
Yeah.
So the costs are very real, but somehow, if you're wired this way, you're just wired this way. There are no alternatives to this. To go back to a Raytheon job or a Lockheed Martin job, you might as well shoot me. And
Yeah.
and I think I would rather live in a tent in the desert than to do that, frankly, because I couldn't stand my bosses, I'm sure. And I'd probably kill them, or they would kill me. And generally in those environments, the little guy doesn't win.
Yep. That's I it's interesting that you said you might as well shoot me, because I have actually used that same verbiage to describe, you know, the idea of the 9 to 5 for 30 years
Yeah.
and then retire and be comfortable and safe. And to me, like, that's not exciting. And it's not fulfilling. I understand it,
But we're wired strangely.
yeah.
You know, my wife, she was our executive at Raytheon, 30 years at Hughes. She got a great retirement program. She's retired now, happy as a clam. She never, found it boring or any of those things. I'm just wired differently than her, and she's originally German, and her German family just does not understand me at all. Right? They this does not compute for them. They say the guy races cars, yet he's got his own businesses. How does he make money? We don't really understand. Um, they just always were asking me questions about this, and it was just not what you did in Germany, right? You went to work for BMW or Mercedes or whoever it was, Lufthansa, and you worked your entire life there. And so in our culture, in America, we're a little different for
All right.
one. We're risk takers sort of genetically. If you think about what it must have been like in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, hell, even this last century, to come to this country, but particularly back when you had no idea what was going on. You couldn't pick the phone up and call somebody. You couldn't get pictures. None of this. And somebody tells you, oh, America, the roads are paved with gold. You go to New York, you get a job. Okay, so you get on the boat, you save up enough money, you get over here, you go through Ellis Island, step on the streets of New York. Now what? Now what are you going to do? Right?
Right.
You have to have enough faith in yourself, and you got your family in tow that you're going to go make it in this environment where you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, you don't know the people. Maybe you know 2 or 3 people if you're lucky, right? Think about that. That was a selection of risk takers, and that's why this culture is different. I'm convinced of it.
I
I don't
love
care.
it.
I don't care if you came from Mexico, your family came from Mexico, England, China, whatever. It universally selects out the risk takers.
Absolutely. And oh man, you're so right. So a couple things I didn't mention earlier. So I lived in Europe as well. My dad was in the Navy. So we moved to there in 91 and we left in 99. So around the same time you were, lived in Spain and Italy. Got to get to know the culture there, right? And experience that. Both my parents are immigrants from Cuba. My dad actually left Cuba when he was 14 years old, escaped through Mexico, and was 14 alone in Mexico. And
Risk
then,
taker.
right, that's exactly what I'm saying. My grandfather, my mom's mom, he was, I want to say he was 35, had 4 kids, and came to the U.S. and literally with the bag, 1 bag per person that they could carry. My mother
Right.
she still chokes up telling the story about the one toy that she had, the doll. They ripped it apart just in case they were hiding diamonds in there. She was 5.
Uh,
Yeah, right. I feel the
uh,
same way.
yeah, I know.
Yeah,
Well, I until you've experienced that, just bringing 1 bag with your family, and that's what we had to do in Toulouse. We couldn't move. I couldn't afford to move my whole life's possessions. I had to put it in a storage unit, and leave it and say goodbye and just take what we could. Until you've done that, you just don't understand what it means. And you go to the store and it's like,
where do you sleep the first night? That's always like the first thing, right? You just arrived, you get off this airplane or this boat or whatever it is. Where do you sleep tonight?
yeah, right.
You can't
Exactly.
ask anybody anything. You don't even know how to speak the language.
Right. Yeah.
You can hope that when you say hotel, they'll know what you mean, right? Like that's the level we're at now. Kids in tow. It's
Yeah.
incredible.
Building a business is the same way, though.
Yeah.
I mean, you go back to your original question. It's just like that, right? So you're like, okay, my first day in business, what do I do? Find customers. Better have a good skill. You better be able to do something that people want to buy. You better have thought this through. And it's no different than moving to the new world. It just isn't.
It's awesome. And I think about, so how long before now, okay, when you started that company, I assume you didn't have any clients, or did you have clients already?
I had lined up a couple.
Okay.
I'm just not the kind of guy that starts businesses without having some runway.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of people that do that without any runway, and I don't advise it. But some of them are very successful. But yeah, I would always, call my friends and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. And oh yeah, we'll give you a little, so you put this consortium of dollars together and you start to see, I remember counting it on my spreadsheet. Oh, 3,000 a month. Oh, 5,000 a month. So seven. Okay. 7,000 a month. We just hit the lottery. We're making more than we made at the other place, and
Mm.
then it goes from there, you know, same with Phantom, we ended up with the satellite project. And so both Mike and I put our own money to start the company. We had written personal checks to finance the company. So, we weren't actually jumping out of the airplane with nothing.
Mhm.
At least you have to have a plan.
Yeah. Did you already have revenue coming in, or did you have revenue sort of lined up?
We had it, we had it kind of coming in because I was getting paid as a consultant on the satellite, and then we just converted over to the company. And so yeah, it worked out very nice. I did that, with StratSpace when I started it. I had some guys that wanted to pay me to consult, and Elon wouldn't let me, and so that was one of the reasons I said, well, I got all these guys that want to give me this money, and he's not paying me anything. I might as well, and he yells at me at 3 a.m, so I might as well go do this other thing. It was literally my thinking process, right? And so I did, and I made lots of money at StratSpace, and I got no regrets.
Yeah. That's interesting. You mentioned that about, he yells at me at 3 a.m, and how much, um, how much leadership
Oh
can
boy.
invert. Yeah. I don't,
Yeah.
I mean, so I've written a book on leadership. I've been in leadership for 20 years, and I hear something like that. Right. And immediately I start thinking about the cost of turnover and the cost of replacing somebody like you. That's not cheap. And, that level of experience isn't easy to find, and that's going to cost you a lot of money. And, sometimes I think, maybe a fewer, less 3 a.m. phone calls, you might have saved yourself quite a bit of money in the long run.
It's an interesting question, yeah, because he would call me at 3 a.m. because he never slept, right? And
That's
I
wild, by the way.
oh yeah, no, I'm not wired that way. 10 o'clock comes around, I'm like, where's the bed? I'm ready for bed. I'm like an old man.
Yeah.
But of course, he would sleep in. He would finally go to sleep at 4 or 5, and then wake up at about 9. But still, he called me at 3 a.m. because something was really concerning him. And of course, the quality of thought you get from me at 3 a.m. is about this much, right? And I don't think it's a good management practice. I don't do it, but you can't argue with where the dude's gotten in
Right.
his career, and it's served him well. And I think his secret is different than a lot of ours. But I'm beginning to, and I hate to admit this, but I'm beginning more and more as I get older to see the wisdom of Elon's ways. But he insists that everybody be perfectly aligned with his vision. I mean, he's got a vision, and if you're not aligned with it, you might as well get the hell out.
Right.
And I'm actually that way now, right? And I'm not. It's not that you need to be aligned with my vision, but we have a vision as a company, and if you're not aligned with it, then we don't want you in the company,
Sure.
right? It's the end result's the same. It's the delivery that's different,
Mhm.
and he will tell you exactly the words I told you, or at least would have back in the day, that this is my vision. If you're not aligned, get the hell out.
Mhm.
And so some of it's kind of just the delivery, and there's power in alignment in that vision, because it's no longer work. It's a passion. It's a life's purpose.
Right.
And I can tell you right now, I'm having more fun doing my job than I have had in a decade. I mean, it's been a long, long, long time since I've had this much fun, and probably since I started my automotive company. That was a passion for me, and it's hard to make money in that business, but it's a lot easier to make it in space.
Hold on. It just occurred to me. You're building a factory from scratch.
Yeah, we haven't started building a factory. Well, I guess we have, but yeah, we'll be building the factory from scratch.
That's
Yeah,
yeah. It just clicked now. Thinking about what you're doing, and that's legit. That is not. That is a bear.
it's a bear,
Yeah.
but with enough time and enough the right talent, again, aligned to a vision, you get it done. It's just not it's not an impossibility. There's nothing that we're doing that's new science, right? What scares me is like having to invent something completely new.
Yeah.
And that's an entirely different problem to solve than to say, well, we have this big machine we have to build. And it's like I built my own house once, and that's the only time I'll ever do it. I will never do it again. And I remember thinking, where do you start? And somebody told me, they said, in the lower left-hand corner. And I said, which corner is that? And they said, I don't know, pick it, right? So, but with a house, you start with a set of plans, and then you dig the hole, and then you fill the hole with concrete, and hopefully it's in the right form, and with all the rebar and all that in it, and then you build a frame on top of it. You just start somewhere.
Yeah.
I restore a lot of cars, and it's the same problem. Some of them I buy and they're like in pieces. Like I've got a Lamborghini now that's in boxes, these parts boxes.
Who doesn't?
Right. Where do you start? Right. You just pick something and I'm going to go with that. Do something that you can do today and to accomplish it. Right. And then pick something tomorrow that you can do tomorrow. And pretty soon you start to see the pattern and you get smarter with time.
Yeah.
That's how you do a rocket factory. It's really kind of the same way.
Sure. Yeah. So tell me, what do you see next 10 years in the space industry? Where do you think we get in the next 10 years?
I think you're going to see this explosion of the number of satellites continue. It's gone, like last year we launched 1,200 satellites. Now, 1,200 satellites is more than were launched in the entire 50 years prior to 2001, right? So it's an enormous amount of satellites in 1 year. And we've seen satellite manufacturers go from, there was about 8 or 9 when I first got into the business back in the 80s, to well over 2,500 manufacturers of satellites in the world. We're going to see that explosion happen and continue to happen. So, it will no longer be a barrier to entry. The barrier to entry is getting stuff into space. So if we're successful, or others are successful in getting more frequent launches, we're going to start to see the applications of these satellites being in orbit touching our daily lives in a more overt way. Right now, they touch our daily lives in ways we don't realize. Like every one of your phones has GPS chips in it, and those GPS satellites were a Navy invention, right? That was for navigation on the seas. I don't know when you were in the Navy, but back in the 70s was when Navstar was first built, and it was to just be able to get quick navigation updates from submarines, just so they didn't have to sit on the surface very long, and from surface ships. And rather than doing the sextant and all of that stuff that I'm sure you learned in the Naval Academy, you could do it electronically. Now the GPS satellites, hell, every damn car and phone and everything's got a GPS chip in it, so we know where everything is, good and bad.
Right.
Okay, and then bits moving through space. My bits going from your computer to mine, I think they're going terrestrially, but they could be going through a satellite. Right. It just depends. And there's probably not enough delay here to make it go through a satellite. But what we're going to start to see is a revolution where the Earth is being observed in ways that it never has been observed before. And the ways it has been observed, photographed, will be more and more common. And we already are starting to see living, breathing digital image clouds of the Earth's surface. And there are things you can do with that you can never do before. I was part of a Pentagon program about 6 years ago, where we set up a neighborhood watch program on North Korea, because our big spy satellites, they knew to hide from them. So we used these little commercial ones that came over sort of random times to just take pictures of North Korea. We couldn't convince the commercial guys to take pictures of North Korea because nobody wanted to buy it. So we set up a front company to buy the stuff, and they didn't want to know it was going to the guys in the Pentagon. And then we watched every time they were, so they blow a bomb off, and we go, okay, let's go back, 20 days. And we could see that they did this, they didn't do this. That was uncharacteristic of them. So that's how we were able to finally predict when the North Koreans were going to set off weapons or launch ballistic missiles. You can do that for anything if you like, try to predict nation state behavior, try to predict, commercial behavior. We were looking at, in skybox imaging, we were using that imagery to look at patterns of traffic in in just parking lots and Walmart parking lots. So somebody wants to buy a piece of property on either side of Walmart. Well, you start looking at, well, the cars go this way, and there's this kind of car that does this, and they more frequently come over here. So, these cars tend to have, drivers and owners who have this kind of economic. And so it made a difference between one side or the other. So you'd buy the one side of the property to put a higher end store on than the other side, So it's amazing the stuff that you can do in space. And then the other thing we'll start to see, and I think this will be gradual, is tourism in space. A lot of people talk about this as one of the big industries. I'm not as bullish on it. I think it's going to happen, but I think joyriding in space will become a minor part of the whole thing, just because it's so expensive. Whereas, bit movement, there's right now about $400 million a year being spent on bit movement through space. Within 10 years, I think it will be close to a trillion and a half just for bit movement. And, you'll see maybe a couple, maybe $100 billion worth of space tourism. So that's just to give you a feel of the relative scale of the economy. Eventually, and I don't think it will be within 10 years, you'll start to see extraterrestrial mining for resources that are not common or not easily available on the surface of the Earth. Again, the cost of getting that back is really, really high. And to go back to Phantom's basic business premise is get it up there, move it around, bring it back. That's what the business we're in.
Oh, you're definitely in the right market for that. I always thought about just travel, getting from San Francisco to London, being able to go into space. You're going to, it becomes a day trip.
Yeah, I think that's going to happen too. So this point to point, the military is pushing that right now. They want point to point delivery. So if you got a bunch of guys in Afghanistan, they're in deep shit, you can get them something in 35 minutes. You just have to make it. Say again?
So I was in the 82nd Airborne. So I was in the Army. My dad was the one that was in the Navy. With the 82nd Airborne's mission is to be able to get anywhere in the world with it. I want to say it was 18 hours notice, if I remember correctly. So that's on a regular, prop plane, right. Getting there, and you just mentioned that, and I'm thinking, yeah, that's exactly, cutting that time down where you can have your quick reaction forces stateside. That's a big deal.
Yeah, we worked on a program at Paragon. You mentioned Grant during our pre-interview talk. And at Paragon, we had a program we worked on a little bit called Sustain, where the crazy Marines wanted to put a bunch of guys in the front end of an ICBM and shoot them off and, to meet the bad guys. And the problem was you kill the Marines by the time they got there with the G forces. But it was really, really tough to do. But Marines were gung ho. I mean, they're like, yeah, put us in. We don't care. Make us into spam. We'll get close and cuddly.
You mentioned about the North Korea imagery, but around what time was that? What year do you remember?
So that would have been 2014, 2015.
Okay.
Probably closer to 2015 when we finally got it to work.
So I was working in my last couple of years in the Army. I was working a counter weapons of mass destruction intelligence, and we had the North Korea problem. So that was 2010, 2011. And I remember exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. These guys would hide. They do stuff at night, and so our national assets weren't worth a shit over there. And we had no sources inside. So it was very, very, very tough to know what the North Koreans were doing.
Yeah. I have technically been inside North Korea. I went to the DMZ and I walked in the building to the North Korean side. So, in the DMZ, they have a building and I got to stand on the North Korean side. So I have technically crossed the border into North Korea.
Yeah. I've been enough time in communist countries. I'm I'll just stay here. Yeah, just what I need. Go to North Korea and get arrested.
Don't do that. So if somebody wants to get a hold of you, or look into Phantom Space or whatever it may be, how do they do that? And what type of person is the best kind of person to be contacting you?
So if you want to get a hold of me, I've got a personal website, jimcantrell.com, and you can just send an inquiry. And a lot of people do that. like if it's media or whatever. Yeah, a lot of media people like to talk to me about, the Elon experience and some of these other crazy things. If you're interested in phantom space, it's phantomspace.com. We're actively recruiting, so if you think you can be one of us, the ones, the Marines. What's the phrase?
The few, the proud.
The few, the
You
proud.
can
Yeah,
be all you can be.
right,
Aim
right.
high.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, we're looking for the best, and we don't care if you're young, old, or whatever, but we want the best. So yeah, we're hiring, definitely.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us here. And I guess, if somebody has followed this story all the way to this point and they haven't already given this a like, I think, Jim, you've earned one.
Well, thank you.
But
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, it's been like I say, it's been a bunch of random experiences in my life, but it's starting to make sense to me.
it's one heck of a cool story. And I appreciate you coming out
Thank you. My
and
pleasure.
talking to us about it. Thank
All
you.
right.